For a country that prides itself on engineering marvels and automotive freedom, America has also produced some of the most shockingly dangerous cars ever to hit the road. These weren't just bad designs. They were time bombs with wheels. In the name of cost-cutting, rush production, or sheer incompetence, automakers rolled out vehicles that lacked crash protection, steering reliability, or even brakes that worked consistently. Here are 10 American cars so dangerous, so disgraceful, you'll wonder how they were ever allowed to leave the factory.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10, the 1971 AMC Gremlin. Introduced by American Motors Corporation as a response to the rising popularity of compact imports like the Volkswagen Beetle and Toyota Corolla, the Gremlin was bold, quirky, and incredibly cheap. But with cost-cutting came compromise, and in the Gremlin's case, safety took a backseat to expedience. From structural fragility to fire hazards, the 1971 Gremlin exemplified the dangers of putting affordability ahead of engineering integrity. AMC introduced the Gremlin in April 1970, not as a ground-up new car, but as a chopped version of the AMC Hornet. The company literally cut 18 inches off the Hornet's rear and called it a hatchback. This created an awkward profile and an unbalanced vehicle geometry. The rush to market resulted in untested design shortcuts, many of which compromised structural performance. In short, AMC tried to win the subcompact war by getting there first, but the Gremlin wasn't ready. One of the most alarming engineering decisions in the Gremlin involved the placement of its fuel tank. The tank was located directly behind the rear axle, just inches from the rear bumper. There was little to no reinforcement between the tank and the rear of the car. In even a moderate-speed rear-end collision, the fuel tank could rupture or be punctured, leading to fuel leaks or fires. This design flaw predated but eerily mirrored the infamous Ford Pinto fire scandal, which would erupt later in the decade. The Gremlin, however, rarely receives the same scrutiny, even though it posed a similar risk. The Gremlin also fared poorly in crash protection for both front and side impacts. Crumple zones were virtually non-existent, and AMC had done minimal crash testing. The subcompact wheelbase and short crumple space left little room to absorb energy in a head-on crash. Side impact protection was minimal, with thin doors and no internal door beams. The steering column was not fully collapsible, raising the risk of driver injury during frontal impact. In short, the car folded quickly under pressure, and with no real energy management, occupants absorbed the brunt of every crash. Inside, the 1971 Gremlin was a sparse and somewhat crude environment. The dashboard was metallic and hard, with minimal padding. The steering wheel lacked any kind of energy-absorbing features. Early models came with only lap belts, and even those were often poorly anchored. There were no headrests, no airbags, and no proper crash structure surrounding occupants. The interior did not just feel cheap, it was genuinely unsafe in a collision. Because of its chopped-down Hornet origins, the Gremlin had unusual handling dynamics. The short rear overhang and long hood gave it a front-heavy balance, leading to understeer and unpredictable handling. It rode on narrow bias ply tires, offering limited grip. The brakes were basic drums on all four corners, unless upgraded, with significant fade under repeated stops. This made the Gremlin not just unsafe in crashes, but also difficult to avoid crashes with, particularly on highways or in emergency maneuvers. To understand the Gremlin's safety record, we must view it in context. The U.S. Department of Transportation was just beginning to roll out mandatory safety regulations in the early 1970s. Rear impact standards didn't yet require fuel tank protection. Automakers were still largely self-policing when it came to crash testing and occupant safety. AMC took full advantage of the regulatory gray area, producing a car that barely met existing standards while cutting every corner possible to keep costs low. Interestingly, the Gremlin enjoyed some early sales success. It was marketed as a cute, affordable American alternative to foreign compacts. Young buyers were drawn to its funky looks and low price tag, but reliability and crashworthiness were frequently criticized by consumer groups and safety advocates. By the mid-1970s, the Gremlin's reputation began to erode, and many early owners experienced firsthand the dangers of its fragile design. In conclusion, the 1971 AMC Gremlin stands as a cautionary tale in automotive history. While it achieved its goal of being cheap and quick to market, it did so by ignoring fundamental safety design principles, endangering passengers with poor crash protection and fuel tank placement, and setting a troubling precedent for how cost-cutting can endanger lives. Though quirky and memorable, the Gremlin, especially in its early form, was one of the most dangerously under-engineered American cars of its time. Number 9, the 1947 Ford Super Deluxe, a car that perfectly symbolizes the tension between style and safety in post-war American automobiles. While it exuded a new sense of optimism and flair following World War II, the Super Deluxe was, in many ways, a repackaged relic from the pre-war era, especially when it came to safety and engineering. Despite its visual appeal, the Super Deluxe lagged far behind in terms of crash protection, driver control, and passenger survivability. This lecture will unpack why this vehicle, while iconic in appearance, represented a significant danger to its occupants. When the 1947 Ford Super Deluxe debuted, America was in a celebratory mood. Soldiers were coming home, factories were returning to civilian production, and the auto industry was booming. But rather than innovate, Ford, like many manufacturers, chose to simply resume production of its 1941-42 models with minor cosmetic tweaks. The 1947 Super Deluxe was not a new design, but a warmed-over pre-war body and chassis. Most mechanical systems remained unchanged from 1941. This meant that while the styling looked new, the car was rooted in outdated safety and performance standards. The post-war buyer got a shiny car, but beneath the chrome, little had evolved. Perhaps the most serious mechanical drawback of the 1947 Super Deluxe was its continued use of mechanical brakes. Unlike hydraulic systems, which use fluid pressure to evenly distribute braking force, mechanical brakes relied on rods and cables. This resulted in uneven braking, higher maintenance requirements, and dangerously long stopping distances. In emergency situations, the brakes were often slow to respond, particularly in wet or icy conditions. By 1947, hydraulic brakes were becoming the norm. Yet Ford's decision to stick with mechanical systems left drivers at significant risk. Another major flaw was the use of non-laminated safety glass. In a collision, ordinary glass shatters into sharp, jagged shards. Ford's 1947 models had not yet adopted widespread use of laminated or tempered glass. As a result, even a moderate accident could result in horrific facial and neck injuries from exploding windows. This lack of safety glazing turned what should have been minor crashes into life-threatening events, especially for front-seat passengers. The 1947 Super Deluxe was constructed with thick, heavy steel body panels mounted to a ladder-type frame. There were no crumple zones, and the frame didn't absorb impact energy. In a crash, the vehicle didn't deform, the people inside did. The rigid structure transferred all crash energy directly to the occupants. Combined with hard interior surfaces, metal dashboards, protruding knobs, and thin steering wheels, the cabin became a trap of blunt force trauma in an accident. Like virtually all vehicles of its time, the 1947 Super Deluxe came with no seatbelts whatsoever. In a frontal crash, occupants were thrown into the windshield or dashboard. In rollovers or side impacts, they were often ejected entirely from the vehicle. The front seats were bench-style and unanchored, further worsening injury risk. Without even basic head restraints, whiplash and neck injuries were also commonplace, assuming the victim survived the initial impact. Steering in the Super Deluxe was also a safety hazard. It used a recirculating ball steering box, which was prone to excessive play. The large steering wheel and vague response made quick corrections difficult. Combined with narrow tires and soft suspension, the car floated over the road with minimal precision. This made the Super Deluxe difficult to control at higher speeds or in evasive maneuvers, further compounding the vehicle's risk profile. Another overlooked safety issue was the limited visibility and inadequate lighting. Headlights were dim and poorly aimed by modern standards. Side mirrors were small, optional, and often missing. Rear visibility was compromised by the thick pillars and small rear window. Driving at night, especially in rural areas, became an exercise in risk. Not seeing, or being seen, led to an increased rate of collisions, especially at intersections. Number 8, the 1970 Chevrolet Caprice, a full-size sedan that represents the peak of American excess in automotive design, but also one of its most dangerous missteps in terms of handling, braking, and structural safety. While it was marketed as a top-tier luxury offering in Chevrolet's lineup, the 1970 Caprice is better remembered for its bloated dimensions, mushy road manners, and alarming lack of crash protection. This lecture will examine why the Caprice, while visually imposing and comfortable in a straight line, was ultimately a liability when put to the test in real-world driving conditions. Let's begin with the most obvious feature, its sheer bulk. The 1970 Caprice stretched over 18 feet in length and tipped the scales at nearly 4,300 pounds, depending on trim. With size came a false sense of safety. Many buyers equated mass with protection, but that assumption would prove dangerous. This car's mass made it difficult to accelerate quickly, stop efficiently, or maneuver safely in emergencies. The Caprice's presence on the road was undeniable, but it was more of a liability than an asset in terms of active safety. The Caprice's suspension was built for one purpose, comfort, but that came at the expense of control. It featured soft coil springs, a long wheelbase, and vague recirculating ball steering. This resulted in severe body roll, sloppy cornering, and a tendency toward understeer, especially during panic maneuvers. Drivers often had to overcorrect just to stay in their lane during sudden swerves or sharp turns. In essence, the Caprice drove like a couch on casters, smooth until you actually needed precision or agility, at which point it became dangerously unwieldy. Braking in the 1970 Caprice was a major weak point. The base model came equipped with front disc and rear drum brakes, which quickly suffered from fade under repeated use, especially when descending hills or during heavy traffic. The car's immense weight made stopping distances alarmingly long, even with optimal conditions. No anti-lock braking system, ABS, existed, and brake modulation was crude, requiring a strong foot and guesswork to avoid lockup. Drivers often found themselves hurtling toward intersections with too much momentum and too little confidence in their stopping power. Despite its bulk, the Caprice's structural safety was questionable by both period and modern standards. The frame was rigid, but the body lacked effective energy absorption zones. In collisions, especially side impacts, crash forces were transferred directly to the cabin. Seatbelts were rudimentary lap belts, often ignored or optional. The interior dashboard and steering column were made of hard metal, offering little cushioning in a frontal crash. There were no crumple zones, no side impact beams, no rollover protection. The Caprice offered little more than cosmetic steel between its occupants and disaster. On slippery roads or wet pavement, the Caprice's rear-wheel drive layout and weight bias created poor traction conditions. With a heavy front end and light rear, it was prone to fishtailing or spinning out under sudden throttle input. There was no form of traction control. Even skilled drivers found it challenging to maintain control in adverse weather conditions. In icy or rainy conditions, the Caprice became a rolling hazard, lacking the technology or balance to maintain directional stability. While it's tempting to view the Caprice as simply a product of 1970s priorities, comfort, status, and straight-line cruising, that doesn't excuse its glaring safety gaps. By 1970, Europe and Japan were already beginning to implement crash safety engineering and better road manners in passenger cars. Yet American manufacturers clung to outdated ideas. Bigger equals better, and weight means safety, at the expense of real-world protection and responsiveness. In hindsight, the Caprice was more of a land-based illusion, big enough to look secure, but fundamentally unprepared for the demands of modern traffic. To conclude, the 1970 Chevrolet Caprice may have offered prestige and space, but it failed spectacularly in the areas that mattered most in real-world driving. Poor braking performance. Sluggish understeering dynamics. No meaningful structural safety features. Rear-wheel drive instability and a bloated footprint that made emergency handling nearly impossible. For all its grandeur, the Caprice was a rolling paradox. A luxury car that put its passengers at risk in the very situations they needed protection the most. Number 7, the 1958 Edsel Corsair. While the Edsel brand is often mocked for its design missteps, particularly the vertical horse collar grille, what's less discussed is how the Corsair was dangerous by design in ways that extended far beyond poor aesthetics. Underneath its chrome-heavy body and over-promoted technology, the Corsair was a bloated, vision-obstructing, and structurally weak machine that left its drivers and passengers exposed to serious risks. This lecture will dissect how its engineering, safety compromises, and overwhelming size made it a vehicle best remembered not just for failure, but for endangerment. Let's begin with the most obvious, styling. The 1958 Edsel Corsair was designed to stand out, and it did with a vertical grille that quickly became a national punchline. But style came at a steep cost. Massive front and rear overhangs, awkward sightlines, and bloated proportions created a vehicle that was more difficult to see out of and control than its competitors. Thick roof pillars, narrow rear windows, and the high beltline seriously compromised visibility, a crucial factor in accident avoidance. The obsession with being unique translated directly into poorer driver awareness and less control in tight maneuvers or dense traffic. The Edsel Corsair was heavy, and not in a good way. It weighed over 4,300 pounds thanks to overbuilt steel body panels, unnecessary chrome, and a big block engine. This mass wasn't accompanied by improved handling or safety. In fact, it worsened both. The added weight contributed to sluggish acceleration, long stopping distances, and increased rollover risk due to a high center of gravity. In short, the Corsair was like piloting a lead sled. The weight didn't protect, it burdened. Despite its size and apparent toughness, the Corsair's structural design was surprisingly fragile. The body-on-frame layout offered no crumple zones, meaning crash energy was transferred directly into the passenger compartment during a collision. The steel dash and rigid steering column became deadly projectiles in a frontal crash. The car featured no reinforced door structures for side impacts, and seatbelts weren't standard, often omitted entirely. In any serious accident, the Edsel Corsair was more likely to cause injury than prevent it, a rolling contradiction to the era's "bigger is safer" myth. Driving the Corsair was a chore, not a pleasure. Steering was vague and unresponsive, especially at higher speeds, where road feel virtually disappeared. Suspension tuning was overly soft, leading to massive body roll and nosedive under braking. The car's turning circle was wide, and it often floated in curves, requiring constant correction from the driver. In emergency situations, the Corsair was ill-equipped to respond quickly or predictably, making it dangerous to both driver and pedestrians. Brakes on the 1958 Corsair were another significant weakness. The car came equipped with four-wheel drum brakes, which quickly faded under stress and offered limited stopping power. There was no anti-lock technology, and wheel lockup was common, especially on wet roads. The high curb weight made matters worse. Braking distances were alarmingly long, even under ideal conditions. In a panic stop, the Corsair was more likely to keep rolling than come to a safe halt, an unacceptable flaw in any car, let alone one marketed as premium. The Edsel was loaded with gimmicks meant to impress, like the teletouch push-button transmission in the center of the steering wheel hub. But this system often failed and distracted drivers, who had to look down to engage gears. It also added mechanical complexity without offering any safety benefit. In fact, it arguably made driving less intuitive and more error-prone. While the car aimed to feel futuristic, its tech choices were a distraction from the absence of genuine safety engineering. To sum up, the 1958 Edsel Corsair wasn't just an aesthetic failure. It was a dangerous car wrapped in a bad idea. While Ford was aiming to break ground with a bold new brand, the result was a car that obstructed driver visibility, prioritized visual gimmickry over structural safety, handled poorly and braked worse, delivered false confidence through weight and bulk, lacked even the most basic safety features like seat belts, energy absorption, or side impact reinforcement. The Edelbrock Corsair stands as a case study in automotive design gone wrong, not only because it looked absurd, but because it put form so far ahead of function that it became a hazard on the road. Number 6. The 1941 Plymouth Special Deluxe is a perfect example of this pre-war approach to automobile design. It was solidly built by the standards of its day and boasted a loyal customer base, but from a modern engineering and safety standpoint, it was woefully underprepared for anything beyond small-town driving. With no crash protection, hard interiors, and dim lighting, the Special Deluxe didn't age well. By the 1950s and beyond, it had become not just outdated, but outright dangerous. Today's lecture will explore how the Special Deluxe, despite its popularity at the time, was emblematic of an era when safety was an afterthought. The Special Deluxe, like most cars of its era, was designed with absolutely no concept of crashworthiness. There were no crumple zones, no reinforced passenger compartments, and no impact-absorbing structures. In a collision, all energy transferred directly to the occupants. The car featured a solid steel dashboard with protruding knobs, rigid steering columns, and no seatbelts. In frontal impacts, drivers faced a high risk of head, chest, and leg injuries due to these unyielding surfaces. While the design may have seemed rugged, the interior was as unforgiving as the pavement in an accident. Inside the Special Deluxe, everything was metal, hard plastic, or wood grain, look panels with no padding whatsoever. The steering wheel was rigid bakelite, offering no give in a crash. Seat backs were often thin and lacked structural support, folding or breaking under force. There were no headrests, leaving occupants vulnerable to whiplash and rear-end collisions. This cabin, though stylish in 1941, functioned more like a collection of blunt objects during any sudden stop or collision. Mechanically, the 1941 Plymouth rode on leaf springs in the rear and coil springs in the front. While relatively standard for the time, it offered only rudimentary handling capabilities. The suspension was soft and bouncy, designed more for comfort than control. At higher speeds or on uneven surfaces, the car floated and wallowed, making emergency maneuvers difficult. The narrow tires and lack of sway bars added to its instability when cornering or braking sharply. By modern standards, the handling was unpredictable, especially in situations requiring precise driver input. The Special Deluxe was fitted with dim, generator-powered headlights, which paled in comparison to today's halogen or LED systems. Night driving was a challenge, especially on unlit roads. Tail lights and brake lights were small and often hard to see, increasing the risk of rear-end collisions. The car's split windshield and thick pillars slightly reduced forward visibility, though this was not unusual for the time. Still, for a car expected to share roads with increasingly faster and better-lit post-war vehicles, its lighting was dangerously inadequate. Braking technology in the Special Deluxe was limited to mechanically assisted drum brakes, which were prone to fading under heavy use, sensitive to moisture, reducing performance in the rain, uneven in application, causing pulls to one side under hard braking. Stopping distances were long even at moderate speeds, and the system offered no redundancy. If one component failed, the entire braking system could be compromised. Let's be clear, this car predated virtually all modern safety innovations. No seat belts, no airbags, no collapsible steering column, no padded surfaces, no side impact bars or reinforced doors. Even windshields were not laminated in early models, meaning they could shatter dangerously on impact. Everything we take for granted in terms of occupant protection was simply not part of the design conversation in 1941. By the time America's highways expanded in 1941, the 1950s and 60s, the Special Deluxe became woefully outclassed by faster, heavier, and more advanced vehicles. It struggled to keep up with highway speeds, and more importantly, it couldn't stop or maneuver like newer cars. In urban traffic, the lack of crash protection and visibility limitations made it a poor fit for dense environments. For collectors or hobbyists today, the car is charming, but it is best suited for slow, controlled environments far from fast-moving traffic. Number 5. The 1961 Chrysler Newport stood as a bold example of early 1960s American automotive design. It carried the forward-looking optimism of the jet age, with bold styling, unique technology, and Chrysler's trademark flair. Among its standout features was the push-button automatic transmission, a futuristic convenience that wowed car buyers. Yet underneath that gleam and novelty was a vehicle that prioritized style and innovation over driver safety and structural soundness. The Newport of 1961 was more showpiece than shield, with major weaknesses in crash protection, rollover resilience, and overall handling. Today's lecture will explore why the 1961 Newport, though forward-thinking in design, lagged dangerously behind in the one area that mattered most: safety. One of the most iconic features of the 1961 Newport was its push-button automatic transmission, a concept that felt like something out of a sci-fi comic book. Instead of a gear lever, drivers selected drive, reverse, or neutral using buttons on the dashboard. While novel, this system could be confusing in emergencies. Muscle memory wasn't as reliable when hunting for buttons under stress. Additionally, there were reports of accidental gear changes, especially when passengers unfamiliar with the layout leaned against the dashboard. In terms of safety, this added an unnecessary layer of distraction and uncertainty to vehicle control during high-pressure moments. The Newport was a large, heavy car, and its road manners reflected that. Steering feel was loose and disconnected, especially at highway speeds. There was significant play in the wheel, making precise maneuvers difficult. The suspension was soft and tuned for comfort, but that resulted in excessive body roll and understeering corners. Emergency maneuvers, such as swerving or sudden lane changes, were clumsy and unpredictable, increasing the risk of rollover or collision. While it offered a plush ride, the Newport traded away control and responsiveness, which are crucial when avoiding accidents. Perhaps the most concerning issue was the lack of rollover protection. The car had thin roof pillars and minimal structural bracing, especially in hardtop models. In a rollover, the roof could collapse easily, endangering occupants. Door latches of the era were not crash-resistant, meaning a rollover could result in doors flying open and passengers being ejected. Seatbelts were optional and not commonly installed by dealers or buyers in 1961. Even at low speeds, a flipped Newport became a death trap. There was no crumple zone philosophy yet applied to the body or roof structure. Despite its size and power, the 1961 Newport still relied on four-wheel drum brakes, a major liability. These brakes were prone to fading under repeated use, especially on long descents or in stop-and-go traffic. The car's weight and speed capability far exceeded the stopping power of its brakes. It also came with narrow bias-ply tires, which offered poor grip and lacked the stability of modern radial designs. Together, these flaws created a recipe for long stopping distances and poor wet weather performance. The cabin of the Newport was decorated in true early 60s fashion: chrome trim, stylish knobs, and vinyl seats. But from a safety perspective, it was a hard, dangerous environment. Dashboards were made of rigid metal, not padded or collapsible. The steering column was solid and non-collapsible, aimed straight at the driver's chest. There were no headrests, and seats had no reinforcement to prevent collapse during a crash. In even a moderate collision, the cabin became a collection of blunt force hazards. Visibility was another compromised area. The Newport's sweeping rear design and small rear window created significant blind spots, especially when backing up or changing lanes. The massive dashboard and A-pillars limited forward visibility, particularly when cornering. At night, headlight performance was poor, and taillights were often too small to be effective in alerting other drivers. The emphasis on exterior design compromised driver awareness and road vision, contributing to accidents that could otherwise be avoided. The Newport's flaws weren't unique. They were typical of the early 1960s American car industry. At the time, futuristic gadgets and luxury features took precedence over safety. There was no federal requirement for crash testing, no standardization of seat belts, and no consideration of rollover resistance. Chrysler, like its competitors, focused on powertrains and styling, not survivability. Safety wouldn't become a major concern until Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, 1965, began reshaping public perception. In that context, the 1961 Newport was a relic of style-driven hubris, not safety-conscious engineering. Number 4, the 1973 Dodge Dart, a compact car marketed for its affordability, simplicity, and fuel economy. But behind the Dart's unassuming appearance and budget-friendly appeal was a vehicle that was deeply flawed in its structural integrity and occupant protection. While Dodge hoped to attract practical-minded buyers, the Dart came with a silent cost, a severe lack of crashworthiness and safety engineering. The Dart was built to be light, inexpensive, and easy to maintain. That philosophy, however, came at the expense of material strength and cabin protection. The car's sheet metal was extremely thin, minimizing manufacturing costs, but offering little energy absorption in a collision. The basic unibody construction lacked modern reinforcements, especially around the door sills and side pillars. Its small footprint and short wheelbase made it nimble in city driving, but far too vulnerable in accidents, especially against larger vehicles. In essence, the Dart prioritized economy over engineering, and nowhere was that more obvious than in crash scenarios. Inside, the Dart's interior was bare bones and restrictive. Legroom and shoulder space were limited, even by compact standards. In a crash, this cramped environment left little survival space. The dashboard and steering wheel remained unforgiving steel structures with minimal padding. Even though seatbelts were required by 1973, most were lap belts only and lacked retractors or pretensioners. Passengers were often closer to the dashboard, door panels, and steering column, which greatly increased the chance of injury and front and side impacts. The 1973 Dart structure offered virtually no side impact protection, a common problem for compacts of the time, but particularly pronounced in this model. No reinforced door beams, no side curtain airbags, still years away, and thin doors meant that a T-bone collision could be devastating. The front end lacked crumple zones, meaning impact forces were directed straight into the cabin. The steering column was not fully collapsible, which put the driver at risk of impalement in frontal crashes. At highway speeds, the Dart's lightweight body and weak structure made survival in a crash far less likely than in midsize or full-size contemporaries. The Dart was offered with a range of small engines, including the sluggish 198 cubic inch slant 6, that often left drivers struggling to keep up with traffic. Acceleration was tepid, making merging and overtaking risky maneuvers. With just 95 to 105 horsepower, depending on the configuration, the Dart could feel dangerously underpowered on freeways. When combined with non-ABS drum brakes and loose steering, the Dart was hard to correct in emergencies. Ironically, while it was too slow to escape danger, it was also too fragile to survive it. Although the Dart was manageable at low speeds, its safety record at highway speeds was troubling. Poor high-speed stability due to soft suspension and vague steering geometry. Braking distances were long and inconsistent, particularly when the car was loaded or the brakes overheated. The Dart lacked modern aerodynamic design, making it susceptible to crosswinds and unstable at speeds above 65 miles per hour. In short, the Dart simply wasn't meant for sustained highway travel. Yet many Americans used it for exactly that purpose, often with tragic consequences. Although 1973 marked the beginning of more rigorous federal safety standards, the Dart barely kept up. Its bumpers were upgraded that year to meet new 5M crash requirements, but this was purely cosmetic and did nothing to improve passenger protection. Dodge resisted making meaningful upgrades, preferring to keep the Dart as a low-cost option rather than invest in better structure or restraint systems. This meant that while it technically complied with minimum regulations, the Dart remained a death trap in any serious accident. The 1973 Dodge Dart served its purpose as a cheap, simple, easy-to-maintain commuter car, but it failed catastrophically in the area that mattered most, keeping its occupants alive in a crash. With its fragile body, poor impact protection, underpowered drivetrain, and lack of safety equipment, the Dart stands today as a reminder of how automotive cost-cutting once endangered lives. It was small, it was affordable, but it was dangerously unprepared for real-world driving conditions. Number 3, the 1950 Studebaker Commander. Known for its famous bullet nose front end, the Commander looked like a rolling rocket ship, a futuristic leap ahead of its time in styling. But while the Commander dazzled with its looks, it was deeply flawed under the surface. This was a car designed for visual impact, not for occupant safety. The result? A vehicle that may have turned heads, but posed serious risks in real-world accidents. Studebaker's iconic bullet nose grille, inspired by jet-age optimism and aircraft design, dominated the front of the 1950 Commander. While striking to look at, it introduced a major safety issue. The nose protruded prominently from the front bumper and was solid, not collapsible. In the event of a frontal collision, this rigid centerpiece could act as a battering ram, transferring more force directly into the cabin. For pedestrians, the bullet could become a lethal striking surface even at moderate speeds. What was meant to signal progress and modernity instead created a dangerous hazard, both to the occupants and anyone in the Commander's path. The Commander's body-on-frame design lacked any modern crumple zones or energy-absorbing structure. The frame was rigid but not robust, transferring impact energy into the passenger compartment instead of dispersing it. There were no reinforced A or B pillars, making the cabin prone to collapse inside and rollover accidents. The doors could spring open during a crash, a common and deadly flaw in many 1950s vehicles. Overall, the body may have looked futuristic, but its crash integrity was stuck in the past. The interior of the 1950 Commander reflected an era when passive safety simply didn't exist. No seatbelts were standard, not even as an option. Passengers were unrestrained in all circumstances. The dashboard and interior trim were hard metal, with sharp switchgear and protruding knobs. Steering columns were solid and non-collapsible, posing a severe impalement risk in frontal impacts. In essence, the cabin of the Commander was a steel trap, where even low-speed accidents could lead to devastating injuries or fatalities. Though designed as an upscale vehicle, the Commander's road dynamics were below average. Drum brakes on all four wheels were prone to fade, especially during emergency stops or downhill driving. The car's steering response was vague, relying on a recirculating ball system that was imprecise by modern standards. Despite being marketed as advanced, the suspension did little to maintain control in abrupt maneuvers. This meant the Commander was not just unsafe in a crash, but more likely to end up in one. Crash testing was not standardized in 1950, but modern safety simulations and period accident data make it clear. The Studebaker Commander offered almost no crash survivability. In a 30 to 40 mile/hour head-on collision, occupants could be thrown forward into the dashboard, windshield, or steering wheel with fatal force. Side impacts often resulted in intrusion into the cabin, especially if the doors failed to stay latched. Rollover scenarios were grim. The roof was thin and unreinforced, offering little to no protection. Even when compared to other vehicles of its era, the Commander stood out as particularly vulnerable, thanks to its design and lack of basic safety systems. The 1950 Commander was emblematic of the automotive industry's priorities in the early post-war years. Styling, innovation, and marketing took precedence over engineering safety. The bullet nose captured imaginations, but also highlighted how little thought was given to real-world consequences. While other manufacturers slowly began introducing safety glass, optional lap belts, and padded dashboards, Studebaker was still banking on aeronautical aesthetics, even if it made the car more dangerous. The 1950 Studebaker Commander remains a striking example of mid-century American automotive design, but one that also demonstrates how style and safety were dangerously out of sync. With its protruding bullet nose, fragile structure, lack of restraint systems, and poor crash survivability, the Commander was a bold car in the showroom and a lethal one on the road. It serves as a reminder that visual innovation should never come at the expense of occupant protection. Number 2, the Oldsmobile Delta 88 was a quintessential example. Marketed as a luxurious, full-size cruiser with big block V8 performance, the Delta 88 offered ample space, impressive straight-line speed, and bold styling. But underneath all that size and flash was a serious set of safety oversights. The 1968 Delta 88 was a machine designed for comfort and muscle, but not for survival. It suffered from poor braking, questionable handling, and an interior that treated safety as an afterthought. In this lecture, we'll explore how this flagship Oldsmobile became an accident waiting to happen on American roads. The Delta 88 came standard with Oldsmobile's 455 cubic inch V8, a big block engine that could generate substantial torque and highway cruising speed. But while it could go fast, it couldn't stop or turn with the same confidence. Nose-heavy balance created serious understeer, making the car difficult to maneuver in tight corners or evasive situations. The soft suspension, designed for ride comfort, contributed to significant body roll in turns, increasing the likelihood of loss of control. Acceleration and straight-line speed were prioritized, but braking was severely compromised, especially with outdated drum brakes still offered on many trims. On paper, the Delta 88 looked like a muscle luxury hybrid. On the road, it handled like a floating, imprecise barge. One of the Delta 88's most glaring weaknesses was its braking performance. Most versions used four-wheel drum brakes, which were prone to fading under repeated use, especially in emergency braking or downhill driving. Even with optional front disc brakes, stopping distances were alarmingly long by today's standards, often well over 200 feet from 60 miles per hour. Brake feel was vague and inconsistent, and with the car's size and weight, any delay in stopping was amplified. Drivers often didn't realize just how poor the braking was until they needed to stop in a hurry. In many cases, they couldn't. Despite growing awareness of automotive safety in the late 1960s, the 1968 Delta 88 showed little progress. No airbags, no energy-absorbing steering columns, unless added late in the model year, and minimal crash padding inside the cabin. The dash and interior trim were hard metal, with chrome knobs and sharp edges that turned into injury hazards during a crash. Seatbelts were present, but often just lap belts, and even those were commonly tucked under the seats or left unused, with little encouragement from manufacturers. In essence, the interior was a comfort zone in theory, but a danger zone in practice. The Delta 88 was over 18 feet long and weighed in at more than 2 tons. Many assumed this mass translated to safety, but that was a dangerous misconception. The body-on-frame design lacked any sort of crumple zones or engineered impact absorption. In frontal collisions, the rigid frame transferred crash forces directly into the passenger cabin, often causing severe injury to occupants. Side impact resistance was poor, with thin door structures and little to no side intrusion protection. Roof strength in rollover situations was minimal, and the long wheelbase actually increased rollover risk during abrupt lane changes or tire blowouts. It looked like a tank, but behaved more like a paper cruiser in real-world crashes. Statistically and anecdotally, the Delta 88's accident performance was underwhelming. Occupants in frontal crashes were often injured by steering column intrusion, hard dash surfaces, or windshield ejection. Side collisions were especially deadly, as the wide cabin lacked structural support or effective restraint systems. Rollover accidents, while less frequent, were often catastrophic due to roof collapse and complete ejection of unbelted passengers. While insurance ads boasted of steel and strength, crash outcomes told a different story. The Delta 88 was not survivable in high-speed collisions and barely adequate in low-speed ones. The 1968 Oldsmobile Delta 88 encapsulates the contradictions of the late 1960s car market. Power without control, size without safety, and style without substance when it mattered most. It's a sobering reminder of how car makers were still prioritizing appearance and performance over the lives of their customers. It wasn't until years later, after government regulation and public outcry, that real safety engineering became standard practice. Number 1, the 1975 Chevy Nova was a budget car built with disturbing cost-cutting measures. From flimsy construction to dangerously inadequate steering and braking systems, the Nova offered minimal protection in an era when driver safety was just beginning to enter the national conversation. The 1975 Nova was a hit for GM. It was inexpensive, available with multiple trim levels, and offered decent engine options ranging from an anemic inline-six to small block V8s. But its mass-market appeal came with serious compromises. Buyers loved the Nova for its price tag, not its engineering. GM's priority was volume and profit, not occupant protection. The Nova rode on an aging platform with minimal upgrades since the late 1960s, failing to evolve alongside growing safety standards. In short, millions of Americans drove Novas, and most didn't know just how unsafe they were in a crash. The Nova's design was cost-conscious to a fault. Thin-gauge sheet metal was used extensively, especially in the doors and side panels, offering little resistance in a side impact. Poor rust-proofing meant structural corrosion set in quickly, especially in northern states, further weakening the body. Subpar fit and finish often led to rattling trim, loose dash panels, and inconsistent alignment of safety-critical components like doors and latches. This wasn't just an aesthetic issue. In a collision, the Nova's poor structural cohesion became a liability, allowing crumpling and deformation to reach the cabin too easily. One of the Nova's biggest dynamic flaws was its loose and unresponsive steering. Early recirculating ball steering boxes suffered from excessive steering slop, often requiring multiple degrees of wheel input before the car actually responded. The suspension was soft and vague, with significant body roll and imprecise cornering behavior. Emergency maneuvers, like avoiding a sudden obstacle, often led to understeer or even loss of control. Combined with a lack of active safety features like ABS or traction control, the Nova was alarmingly unpredictable at high speeds or on slick surfaces. The braking system on the 1975 Nova was notoriously inconsistent. Many models came with front disc and rear drum brakes, which was better than all drum setups, but still suffered from brake fade under repeated use. Brake lines were prone to corrosion, and pedal feel was mushy, making stopping distances longer than acceptable, even for the time. With its modest curb weight and lack of electronic assist, braking response was often delayed just enough to be dangerous in urban settings. Given the car's popularity among new and young drivers, these braking shortcomings only increased the likelihood of crashes. By 1975, federal mandates required things like seatbelts and energy-absorbing steering columns, and the Nova technically complied, but implementation was inconsistent and often ineffective. Lap shoulder belts were present, but often poorly anchored, uncomfortable, and rarely used by drivers. Dashboards and door panels still featured hard plastic or metal surfaces with little to no energy absorption. The unibody frame offered limited crash protection, and there was no meaningful side impact reinforcement in most trims. The structure did not handle offset frontal collisions well, with cabin intrusion common even in moderate speed impacts. So while the Nova looked compliant on paper, real-world crash survivability was alarmingly poor. Part of what made the Nova so popular was how familiar and simple it felt. But that comfort hid serious dangers. Its compact footprint was seen as safer for fuel economy and maneuverability, but it lacked the structural integrity of larger cars. It felt like a family car, but offered none of the passive or active safety advances that families truly needed. In a world without airbags, with minimal crumple zones and thin door beams, the Nova was a rolling coffin in the wrong kind of crash. The trust people placed in the Nova was undeserved and uninformed, and that's part of what makes it such an important cautionary tale. The 1975 Chevrolet Nova may have been affordable, accessible, and easy to own, but it was also a car built to a price, not a standard of safety. With poor crash protection, questionable handling, and underwhelming build quality, it put drivers and passengers at risk every time they hit the road. This car illustrates a deeper truth about the American auto industry in the 1970s. Cheap didn't just mean affordable, it meant vulnerable, and millions of families paid that price every day without even realizing the danger they were in.